Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
I'm pretty excited about our next guest. It's his first appearance on this programme. I did tell him just before or during that song that it's about time. He should have been asked to come on as a programme before. He's a terrific guy. You will have read him and his extensive research into what happened on September the 11th. Which didn't just change everybody's lives around the world, it changed his life, because as a result of his investigation into what happened on September the 11th and subsequently posting books about it, writing about it, talking about it, he was harassed to the point that he left the United States and moved to Europe. Like I said, he wrote a series of books based on his research, including, called Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World. Now, he writes about lots of things. He writes very succinctly and very thought-provoking articles. You can find them on Bollyn, that's Bollyn, Bollyn.com. Of course, I'm going to tweet that out now. It's a pleasure to welcome to the programme Christopher Bollyn. Chris, you're very welcome. How are you?
Thank you, Richie. It's good to be with you.
Listen, the pleasure is really all ours, and massive interest on our social media pages today about you coming on, particularly late this afternoon, Chris, with the news that the British government has declared, amazingly, well, maybe not so amazingly, has declared that they have intelligence that leads them to believe that the Metrojet Russian plane that came down over Sinai was in fact brought down by an explosive device. Incredible, this. You've been writing about this on Bollyn.com. What have you made of the announcement by the British government? And as we speak, David Cameron is chairing a meeting in London with their sleeves all rolled up, Chris, about what the bloody hell do we do about this. What have you made of this today?
Yeah, that's a very new story that the U.S. and British are saying that a bomb was put on the plane apparently in Sharm el-Sheikh, and that is what caused the plane to come down over the Sinai. That is apparently what the story that they want us to take away from this disaster, and they want us to think that ISIS or ISIL or some affiliate thereof brought down the Russian plane as a response to the Russian intervention in Syria.
Now, can we just start off with the idea that somebody went to the airport and managed to smuggle a bomb on that plane? We're led to believe, Christopher, we're led to believe, you and I, when we go to an airport, no matter where it is in the world, that airport security is uniformed around the world. Since September the 11th, it's changed beyond anything that we ever knew before. It's virtually impossible now to get an explosive device through the many, security checks you have to get through. How could they have done it?
Yeah, it's. I think it's very unlikely, actually. This claim that the U.S., CNN, and the British are saying that a bomb, they have no evidence to back up that claim. They're saying that they have a feeling that it was a bomb. And actually, my article, Suspicions About the Russian Plane Crash, talk about from the very beginning. I followed this, and the evidence indicates that it was not a bomb, that it's very likely that this plane was actually remotely hijacked and then forced to go into a very steep climb, and that it stalled and then it crashed to the ground. Very similar to what happened to the Air Asia plane that crashed in the Java Sea last December 28th.
Yeah. I tell you what, Christopher, delighted to read your articles over the last couple of days, particularly about the way that the media will report something before somebody has any opportunity to stop them, before the people who really control the media have a chance to tell them, don't say this. Sometimes stuff gets out. One of the things we learned on Sunday morning was, two very important things. One, the co-pilot told his wife the plane is not fit for purpose, number one. And number two, we learned that the pilot talked to ground control and said, the plane is not doing well, I need to land in Cairo. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but has that just been airbrushed out of the news the last few days?
Oh, that's very true. The first thing is that the BBC, for example, came out with a story the day before yesterday, I think it was, in which they presented 4 theories, only 4 theories, as to what they say could have brought down the plane. Technical fault, pilot error, a bomb on board, or a missile. Those were the only 4 things. Whereas I said the indications are that the plane was remotely hijacked, and those indications are several. One is that the pilot communication was cut off. His last communication was at about 30,000 feet, and this was printed in the Telegraph from Britain. It said that the last official with Egyptian air traffic control told the local reporters that the pilot complained of malfunction in the wireless devices and had asked for emergency landing at the nearest airport. Now, it's interesting that report was only printed in the Telegraph in Britain and in a lot of newspapers, English-speaking newspapers in India and Asia, because it was one of the very first reports. And that was never printed in any American newspaper, for example. Now, you have to understand that the government of the Sisi government, the military dictatorship down there in Egypt, is very close to Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu, and of course very much dependent and close to the U.S. government. So we have an Egyptian government that is not necessarily looking for the truth, but is going along with the plan or the cover-up. Another thing is that
although to be fair,
yeah.
Chris, he did say, didn't he, that any talk of a terrorist event is propaganda. He was pretty strong in his condemnation of that idea. Was Sisi?
Yes, but if they we'll see how far, we'll see what they can produce to back up their claim that it was a bomb. I mean, it certainly may have been a bomb. I don't know what happened to the plane, but if it were a bomb, that doesn't explain some of the erratic climbs that the plane did in the last half minute of flight that was recorded before it started. At about 27,000 feet, the data transmission from the transponder stopped. Now that's another problem, because at 28,000 feet, all data that was coming in from the transponder ceased to come in anymore. Now that means that either the plane was completely destroyed and the power system was no longer working at 28,000 feet, or that transponder was remotely turned off, as, for example, we know happened to the planes in 9/11. The transponders were turned off. And at that point, there was no communication with the pilot ever since 31,000 feet. So those two things, plus the report that he was complaining about a problem in the wireless, is very important, because the fact that the BBC doesn't report this, doesn't talk about this, means that they are feigning ignorance of drone technology.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, the Israelis and Americans fly drones day in and day out using the very same technology that can be used to hijack a plane. Now, this is very serious because we all fly on planes all the time. And this is an Airbus 321. And Airbus has a very serious problem. And any plane that has a satellite connection to the internet is vulnerable. Now, one of the things that really clued me in from the very beginning was that this plane went down in the Sinai Desert right next to the Israeli border. And on the other side of the Israeli border is the Gaza Strip right there, and an Israeli secret unit called their cyber warfare unit that's called Unit 8200. And 8200 is Israel's cyber warfare hacking department. It's the biggest department of the Israeli Defense Forces, and its goal, its whole mission, is to hack into other computers using cyber warfare to attack and destroy foreign targets
and disable them. Do you know, on that subject, I got to mention this. An old friend of this program's, and he comes on from time to time, is the very experienced naval aviator and commercial pilot Field McConnell. Now, I don't know what your own particular thoughts about Field are. I find Field very eccentric, but a very intelligent guy. But eccentric is fair to say, but he's a lovely guy. I've not spoken to Field yet, but he has spoken about something he blew the whistle on, and that is the Boeing Uninterruptible Autopilot, which Field reckons in the past has been used to take planes out of the hands of pilots and caused them to crash. Now, this is very serious, and that might go some way to explaining why the communications were cut off in the cockpit, Chris, because then the pilot wouldn't be able to say, well, you won't believe what's happened, but the plane has been taken out of my control, or anything else, if there was an explosion or whatever.
Precisely.
What do you think of that? What do you think of that as an idea?
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. This is the signature. So these are the things you look for when you talk about for example, the Malaysian Airlines 370 that disappeared apparently in the Indian Ocean. The very same thing happened. The communications, the normal communication channels between the pilot and the ground were cut off, which is why the co-pilot on that plane was trying to use his cell phone as the plane went over Penang to make a cell phone call. Why was the co-pilot of Malaysian Airlines 370 trying to make a cell phone call from 30,000 feet? Because the communications had been cut. They knew that, and they were in a position where they were being hijacked and could do nothing about it.
Could do nothing about it. Chris, I've got to ask you this, because this is really important. When they have the evil, maniacal scumbags who do these things, who waste the lives of 224 beautiful people who never did anything to anybody, why have they, because they have so much control, how did they get it so wrong with the media? Because they always trip themselves up by not control. We know they have control of the media, but how did they screw it up to the point that, these tidbits of information that are so important came out on Sunday? How did they screw that up? That's a $64 million question.
Yeah, I don't think they screwed it up. I think that, like, for example, this report about the malfunction in the wireless devices, as I said, was only reported in the Telegraph and in Indian newspapers.
That's right, two papers, yeah.
It never made it. It was half a dozen or more than a dozen Indian papers, the Statesman, what have you, the Hindu. But it was not printed in any U.S. media, or it was not reported on CNN or anything like that. So that's control. Now, this Egyptian air traffic control official was speaking to local reporters. And so, in the very beginning, when something like this happens, you will get honest to goodness reports that are close to the truth. But as soon as the spin gets going, the spin machine gets going, then you're going to see that you're going to get stories like the BBC where they give you four choices, none of which include the most likely culprit, which is remote hijacking.
I'm going to read some tweets. You can tweet at Richie Allen Show, email richie@richieallen.co.uk. Remember, follow Christopher on Bollyn. That's Bollyn. I'll do it properly, Chris. It's Bravo, Oscar, Lima, Yankee, November. There you go. You see, I must have been in the military at one time. That's Bollyn.com. Terrific, well thought out, thought-provoking articles on there. So get on there. Stephen Lash, how you doing, Stephen, on Twitter, says, the CBS television show Madam Secretary is currently running a storyline where Air Force One was taken over remotely. That's interesting. I didn't know that. That is very interesting indeed. Joanne was on to say, if the plane was blown up by a bomb, then bits would be scattered like Lockerbie. Right. Now, this, of course, is because the overhead shots we saw, Lockerbie went on forever, didn't it? Right. Yeah, that's just a serious point, that. And she's not the only one to make that point. Several others have made that point as well. A number of people talking about about your comments on the proximity to Israel and Israel having the technology. A lot of people sympathising with that point of view as well. It's at Richie Allen Show on Twitter. Let me just scroll down there as well. And Paul was on to say the ultimate question: who benefits? Who benefits from this happening? We got to, obviously we were kind of segueing into that anyway. In your opinion, Chris, who's got the most to gain from this?
Well, we have to look at what's the background is, of course, Syria, the conflict in Syria, and we have the United States and Britain and all of the so-called international community calling for President Assad to quit and to leave that position, and then the Russians come in, at a point when the American efforts have been a complete disaster, and comes in on support of that President Assad, and so. This is a game. I wrote about this story about Syria and the Russian intervention. I said that we will have to look and see what happens with the people who are supporting the mercenary forces in Syria, because this is unlike chess. This is a game with no rules. And that was I wrote that about 3 weeks ago. And here we see the kind of thing that happens when you cross the Zionist beast. And they will do things like this. Like, three planes last year went down. 3 Malaysian planes went down. 370, 17, and the Air Asia plane, which was a Malaysian-owned airplane. Simply because the Malaysians had the audacity to have an international tribunal in which they found Israel guilty of genocide against the Palestinian people. That was in December or November 2013. The next year, 3 Malaysian planes drop out of the sky. But I wanted one point about that we didn't finish about that, the bomb theory, that if a bomb went off in the plane, that does not explain how the plane then climbed 5,000 feet. The plane went down a little bit, and then it went radically upwards at about 8,000 feet per minute. And that, of course, takes a lot of the speed out of the plane and puts it into a stall. But I mean, a bomb on the plane would not have done that. And if a bomb had gone off on the plane at 31,000 feet, it is, as you say, that the debris would have been spread all over the place, not in a small, ellipse of about 3 miles by 2 miles.
That's right. There's plenty of questions and comments on September the 11th, and we will in a minute switch over to 9/11 because a lot of us learned about Chris, of course, through his writing and investigating of 9/11. So we will turn to 9/11 in a minute. A point made by Paul in an email he just sent to me now. Paul Ryan is listening to the programme in Manchester, interestingly enough, which is where I am. Paul says, look, how are we supposed to believe that ISIS, who are on the run from Russia, who don't have that many in their ranks anyway, but they're now experts in getting bombs on planes? It's nonsense, says Paul. Simple as that.
Right.
I agree with that, to be honest. I have to agree with that. Not my job to be editorialising, but I have to believe that because of what we know about ISIS, who funded them, who trained them, who armed them, that they're not in Egypt near the Israeli border, either A, shooting planes down, or B, getting bombs onto those planes. I can't believe it. I'll give you the last word on that, Chris, and then we'll move on to 9/11.
Well, the one thing in my article that I point out that's very important to understand is that these Airbus planes that have this wireless capacity, they have an antenna on top of them, a high gain antenna, through which an external hacker, a hacker that could be an Israeli or an Egyptian, can hack into the plane, and it can get right into the aircraft navigation system and take over the plane. This is piracy in the sky without the knowledge of the passengers or, of course, the cockpit. They're unaware of this, and so we face this is a very serious public health issue because we all fly planes, and Airbus has some very serious issues here. All airlines, Boeing has the same issue because if a plane has a connection to the internet, that connection can be hacked, and the plane can be taken over by an external pirate. And that's a danger for all of us.
Certainly is. Final question on this, absolutely final question on it for the moment. We'll move on to 9/11. Colin, who's listening in Dublin, asks, Chris, remind us how we know that the plane ascended 5,000 feet after it exploded.
Right. Well, we have the data from the transponder that shows that it was going along at about 400 knots at about 30,000 feet, and then at a certain point, it started to dive, and we see that the vertical feet per minute. This data is in my article. The chart is right there in the article. Suspicions about a Russian plane crash. I added this part today, and it shows these spikes of vertical climbs and vertical drops. And as you see, as the plane is going into, it was going up just like the Air Asia plane. It went into a climb at 8,000 feet per minute, and that means that it lost a lot of speed. And that's when it started. The speed just kept dropping. And when this transponder stopped sending its signal at 27,000 feet, the plane was only going 62 knots per hour.
62 knots, yeah. Which is very slow. It was falling. It had to be falling.
It was falling. Now, if there had been a bomb on the plane at 30,000 feet, you would have, as I said, debris spread over a wide area, and the plane would not be doing these climbs. That was just the first climb. Then it fell. Then it did a climb of 5,000 feet per minute. Then it fell again. Then it did another climb of 7,500 feet per minute. So it did three very serious climbs, all the time losing airspeed.
It's great to have Christopher Bollyn on the programme. Go to bollyn.com and read more there. Lots of questions and comments about September the 11th, which, of course, Christopher investigated and wrote about extensively. And archived articles, of course, on his website as well, which are very interesting. Mike asks me to put this question to you, and it's an interesting one. Chris, I've been, obviously, like anybody else in the independent media, reading and writing and looking at and studying 9/11 for a long, long time. But here's a name now that doesn't come up so often anymore, and it's worth reminding people of: Marvin Bush. And Mike says, ask Chris to mention Marvin Bush and his involvement. He's kind of been forgotten about as Marvin. Yeah, let's talk about Marvin for a minute.
Yeah, I think Marvin Bush is a relative of George Bush, and if I remember correctly, he was part of Stratosec, or a company that had some contract with the World Trade Center
security,
providing security.
That's right.
That's probably that's true, and the Bush family is, of course, completely tied into this catastrophe. I mean, the most obvious crime is that President George Bush did not call for a blue ribbon investigation to investigate what happened to the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on day one. They dallied and prevented that from happening. And for the first 2 years, there was no investigation, basically. And in fact, what people have to understand is that there was never a criminal investigation of 9/11. 3,000 people were killed in Manhattan at the World Trade Center, and no criminal investigation. Rather than having a proper criminal investigation, the FBI, under the control of a man named Michael Chertoff, who was the Assistant Attorney General, basically facilitated the destruction of the evidence so that there would not be an analysis of the steel or of the airplane parts.
Shipping it out, Chris. That's what they did.
Right.
They got rid of it, didn't they?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And they were shipping it out to Asia, the steel, at a time when scrap steel was the lowest it had been in price for 50 years. So they were not making business. They were not making money on this. They were simply destroying the evidence as far away from America as they could get it.
Which is one of the gravest crimes that anybody in law enforcement can commit, destroying the evidence at a crime scene.
Right.
Isn't it? When you think about it, Chris, it's heinous.
Absolutely. And this is a mass murder. This is the crime of the century. And so what I tell Americans and people when I talk about this in my presentations, for example, is a lot of my research in my Solving 9/11 book focuses on the cover up of the crime, and then the people who were behind the promotion of the deception, the lie, the false narrative. But the people who are involved in the cover-up, we know who they are. We know who their names, we know their positions, we know their titles, we know where they live. These people should be prosecuted, because if you're involved in a cover-up of a crime like that, you are a party to the crime.
Well, you're an accessory after the fact. It's as simple as that. You're duty and honour bound to divulge any information that you have heard or that you know to be true about a crime. Just a quick email from Mark about the Russian plane. Could the jet crashing be the US putting pressure on Putin to change his tune on no regime change in Syria? I noticed the bizarre out of the blue statement by the Russian foreign minister about consulting with all opposition voices in Syria, which was interpreted by the Western media as a softening of the Russian stance on keeping Assad in power. I think they were twisting the words of the foreign minister in Russia, who was kind of, I think, being sarcastic. I think the Russian foreign minister was kind of sarcastically saying, we're going to let the Syrian people decide on the future of Syria, which I think was a thinly veiled barb at America. But you might be right, Mark. It might have had something to do with that. But I want to stick with 9/11 for the minute, because this is fascinating. Chris, you know better than anybody that what happened on September the 11th, within journalism, within real journalism and real journalists, and of course the only real journalism in the world is independent journalism, as you well know. It's driven a wedge amongst people, and people have fallen out badly and spectacularly, and in sometimes in displays of anger and vitriol, the likes of which I've never seen within the media. And to me, it all boils down to arguments over whether the architects and the great work the architects for 9/11 truths do, Richard Gage and the guys, whether they're right that explosives were used, or whether the planes didn't exist, if they were some sort of holographic images or whatever. Where are you, Chris? Where are you today? I mean, I know where you've been in the past, but you strike me as an open-minded guy who will always evaluate what you believe and change your opinion if you ever see any contradicting or contravening evidence. Were there planes, Chris? Were there actual planes? Now, I really don't know. I'm not setting you up for anything. I don't know. Were there planes, or was it something else?
Oh yes, I certainly believe there were planes. There were planes in the World Trade Center, and there was a plane involved at the Pentagon. Although a plane did not go into the Pentagon at that low level where we saw, because there was simply no plane debris to be found, and the wall was completely standing. There's no way that a plane can fly across the lawn of the Pentagon and penetrate the building without leaving a hole or without leaving debris outside. And at the World Trade Center, yes, I believe there were definitely planes. You see, you have to understand that there's a lot of people who are trying to muddy the waters and to make issues and to make contrary theories come forward, because just to cause dissent among the group and to divide the group, basically a divide and conquer type thing. Weaken the whole movement by getting people to argue and bicker among themselves.
No, I don't doubt that. Can I just interject there? I don't doubt that. Now, I know that veterans today have been unkind about you previously in articles they've written, and I can't speak for anybody who writes for veterans today, but I have spoken over the years with Jim Fetzer. Now, I'll tell you where I am. I said I don't know, which I don't know, but I'm inclined to agree with you. I'm inclined to believe that something hit the buildings and that they were most likely some sort of plane. So I'm kind of with you on that. Now, I know that Jim, I suppose, is most synonymous, along with people like Judy Wood and others, of this no plane theory. Now, while I totally agree with you, because I see it all the time, people acting like journalists, saying things that are deliberately designed to look crazy to take away from, the good journalism being done. I can, speaking for Jim, you might not like Jim, you might have problems with Jim. With Jim, I think Jim believes that. I think he believes it passionately. Others, I don't know, but I'm inclined to agree with you that there are agent provocateurs, whatever you want to call them, that are out there to try and make people like you look stupid. No doubt.
Right. But what I do is I work from the evidence. When we talk about the plane striking the second tower, for example, we have good images, and it appears that the plane actually had a missile pod underneath the fuselage. In fact, both planes did, and that they fired some sort of incendiary missile into the building, which struck just a millisecond before the plane actually struck the building, and with the building South Tower, with the plane 175, when you look at that video, you actually see a missile device coming out the other side of the building, a glowing white-hot object flying out, leaving behind a trail of dark oxides, and another piece that's leaving a gray smoke, burning. Quite different objects burning here, but they're coming out of that building with a great deal of momentum. If these were holograms or something like that, how did they shoot these devices out the building? Did they have a catapult in there? No. There were planes, and these planes had missiles on them. And another thing is that the discovery of nanothermite, super thermite in the dust of the World Trade Center. When that discovery was really made in 2009 and published, the following year, Judy Wood came out with this book about direct energy weapons being involved. Now, the problem with her book is that she says in the beginning and the end and throughout the book that the destruction of the World Trade Center was a cold event. Well, the evidence indicates that it was anything but a cold event. In fact, it was a very, very hot event, which is why so many people jumped to their deaths because, the South Tower, before it fell, for about 7 minutes, molten iron was falling from the 81st
That's right.
floor.
Not to mention, weeks later, there was still this molten steel, which was still very hot.
Yeah.
In the,
so
in
they
the
were very hot events. There were nothing cold about them. So right there, her thesis rests on this idea that the premise that this was a cold event. Well, there was nothing cold about it. So
now I'll tell you why I like Judy's idea. Now I find Judy very strange. I think Judy, God love her, is a bit of a diva. I think because I've asked her to come on this program in the past, and she's gone all diva on me and said I won't come on unless David Icke is present and all this nonsense. So listen, I make, produce, write, and broadcast live radio programs that don't have anything to do with David. David's a very, very good friend who puts the program out for me, doing me and the listeners a huge favour. But David doesn't have anything to do with the editorial content of it, much as I wish he would sometimes, because he knows so much and he's got so much information. But I said, no, we're not doing that. You and I are going to talk. Oh, well, I'm going to give you a list of questions then. And then I said, Julie, look, forget about it. Because obviously I would contradict or question some of what you're saying. But I do like you. And I'll tell you what, I do like her. I'll tell you what, Chris, I wouldn't, it wouldn't be beyond the lunatics, those hidden factors that, that we don't see, that are really pulling the strings. That they have come up with direct energy weapons, but the problem, but whether proven this, but I will say this, and I've come around to now saying what I was going to say. Where I kind of like Judy's direct energy theory is, those buildings disintegrated, Chris. They completely disintegrated. They turned to dust almost instantaneously. Now, I've never seen a collapse ever. We see them all the time when casinos are brought down, all these big buildings. I've never seen that happen before. There's usually a big pile of concrete and rubble. Where did that concrete go? That's the only issue I have. I'm inclined to agree with you, but I'm still thinking we've never seen a collapse like that before.
No, that's true. We have never seen a collapse like that before. And the pulverization of the concrete is, of course, hard to explain. But you have to understand that this nanothermite, this is thermite that's made using nanotechnology, is an explosive of a completely another dimension than traditional explosives. And the energy yields are incredible. So these materials can be tailored to produce so much energy, so much heat that you can pulverize concrete floors like we saw. I mean, the amount of energy was so incredible that for 3 months later, there were fires burning beneath the rubble pile. And when they got down to the bottom of the rubble pile, they found molten iron in the molten state.
Yeah, that's right.
This is like a month, 3 months to 5 weeks later, when they finally got down to the bedrock, they found this, and they found this molten iron in the basements, the sub basements of all 3 towers, 1, 2, and 7. And I mean, this is one of the first indications that some very exotic explosives were used, and the nanothermite, the super thermite that was used, is something that can only be produced in a military level laboratory like in.
Now we have tweets on this. Carl and Alan, to name 2, understand nanothermite, they say, but they don't believe that it could dissolve thousands of tons even of concrete in 10 seconds on the scale that we saw. That's their opinion. Scott was on to say, we all know jet fuel doesn't burn at a high enough temperature to melt steel. Chris would agree with that, and Chris has written extensively about that over the years, no doubt about that. What about Building 7, asked Patrick Garrett. I mean, this is the ultimate red herring, isn't it, Chris? When you talk about trying to explain to people, I get asked sometimes to go and give talks. Now, not very often, because I don't do that. But because I've been interested in September 11th for a long time, people say, oh, Richie, will you come down the country and come and speak about 9/11? I say, look, there are a lot more learned men and women you can get than me to talk about it. But I always say to people, when you are being criticised by your friends and called a conspiracy theorist, tell them 2 or 3 facts that are completely undisputed about September 11th. One, I always say, being that, as you quite eloquently described it, Chris, the worst mass murder terrorist attack on American soil in history, and 3 million quid was given to the head of the 9/11 Commission. 3 bloody million. They spent 50 million quid investigating whether Clinton had oral sex or not. I always say that to people. I always say that my mind has gone blank now. The head of the commission, who wrote a book, who basically said that it was set up to fail. I always say, look at that. The guy who was given the job. Why is my mind gone blank now?
Philip Zelikow was the head of the 9/11 Commission, and
who was the lawyer? Thomas Keane. That's right,
Keane.
Thomas
Yeah.
Keane. He wrote a book in 2006. He said it was a joke. He basically says this, and he could not get interviewed on commercial television or radio. Imagine the guy who was the lawyer for the commission, the guy looking over the whole thing, writes a book and says it's a load of nonsense. That's right, can't get on television. And I always say to people, this absolute empirical evidence that the whole thing was nonsense. It was all a setup.
Right, as you say, that there was in fact no criminal investigation of the evidence to start with, and these engineering reports that were done were written by engineers who were only allowed to go and do a walkabout for a couple hours, once or maybe twice at the Pentagon and at the World Trade Center. All of the evidence was basically destroyed. Some of it was seen, and one Jonathan Barnett, who was part of the investigation of the World Trade Center, he found steel beams that were vaporized. And that that there had been it had gotten so thin to paper thinness, and then sections of the beams were just completely vaporized.
What about mini nukes, Chris? Do mini nukes exist? Can you have a nuclear event that you can control over a small space, over a small area? Is that possible?
That's a very good question. I worked with a man named Marion Falk at Lawrence Livermore Lab. He helped me with my depleted uranium research, and I asked him about that, about the idea that mini nukes could be used. And this man actually worked on the Manhattan Project, and with he's been part of the nuclear bomb production in the United States since the Manhattan Project. And he said no. He said that the idea of a nuke is that it's a growing thing. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And he did not think that the micro nuke theory was valid. And for example, I asked him, for example, to look at that piece of white hot burning substance that came out of the World Trade Center. As I said, when the plane hit it, it came out the other side, and it was leaving behind a gap and then some black oxides. And I said, does that look like a burning uranium warhead? And he said, yes, that has the characteristics of a burning uranium warhead.
Wow.
And I asked him that because he was a person who I spent a lot of time with learning about depleted uranium in the context of the Gulf War and whatnot.
Funny you say that, Chris. Sorry again to interrupt you now. I don't normally do that, but we're running out of time. And as you're speaking, listeners are reacting in their droves. And they really are on Twitter. You've only got to go to our Twitter page and just put in Richie Allen Show and see it there. Number of people saying that New Yorkers have been more sick and have been suffering symptoms, sometimes like radiation symptoms, since 2001.
Yes.
Is there evidence of that?
Yes. About 1,700 first responders and firefighters and policemen
are dead.
Who worked at are dead. Jeez. And this is because, as I said, this incredibly hot fire that was burning, these chemical reactions that were burning beneath the World Trade Center were producing a smoke that was abundant in nanoparticles, extremely small particles. And this is exactly like my research in depleted uranium. When you inhale these extremely small particles, these ultrafine particles, they are so small that they will penetrate into the cells of the nucleus of your cells, and that's where they wreak the most damage. That's where they really damage the human system, and they cause cancers and very exotic diseases that you never get. So young people who are 30, 40 years old have been dropping dead from these sicknesses that they got because they inhaled the smoke that was rising from the pile.
It's terrible that. James Kershaw on email. How you doing, James? Richie, if it was a bomb, it would have been planted by security services, but it wasn't a bomb, says James, in his opinion. Mm-hmm. Colin Houlden is listening on the Costa del Sol in sunny Spain. How you doing, Colin? Listening on richieallen.co.uk. One or two problems with one or two of the other players, depending. I understand the internet service providers in Spain, it's difficult. I lived there for 8.5 years. Internet speeds are slow. It's a problem. I know that. Don't forget the program is podcasted. It will be online in great quality in around about 35 minutes time. A couple of more questions about the Boeing Uninterruptible Autopilot system. One or two people saying, for all we know, that could have been used on 9/11. It might have been, around then, and it might well have been used on 9/11. Who can argue?
Of course. As I point out in this article that I wrote about this Russian plane, there was, Rupert Murdoch and Arnon Milchan, his Israeli buddy. They made a film in the year 2000 in Vancouver, Canada, about it's called The Lone Gunman. in which exactly that scenario happens. The pilot's flying a plane to New York City, and he finds out at the last minute that the remote pilot has been hijacked by an external hijacker, and the plane is being flown into the World Trade Center. And this television program aired on Fox TV in March of 2001. And this is Arnon Milchan, Mr. Mossad in Hollywood. His first movie he made was a British-French production called The Medusa Touch with Richard Burton.
Oh, I remember that. You're showing your age there now, Chris.
Yeah, in which a plane flies right into the Pan Am building. So this idea of flying planes into building and remote controlling planes, one of the head guys of the Mossad said earlier this year, he said, his name is Carmi Gilon. He said, a terror organization could take over a jet plane and achieve something like 9/11 without fielding any flesh and blood attackers. And he's the head of Shin Bet, and it's in an article about cyber warfare, because this is what they can do, and they've been doing it for a long time. You can hijack a plane and you can crash it. You can put it into a really fast climb, which makes it stall, loses all its speed, and falls into the ocean. That's what they did with Air Asia. That's what they did Air Asia back to December 28th last year, and that's what they did with this plane, I think, in Russia, or in the Sinai, the Russian plane in the Sinai.
Chris, that just about brings us to the end of this. Thanks for coming on. It's about time that you came on the programme. It really
Thank
is.
you.
It was lovely chatting with you. Thanks for your insight. Thanks to everybody who's tweeted in as well. Follow Chris, if you haven't done already, on Bollyn.com. That's Bollyn.com. There is a lot of archived articles on there you'll find really interesting, and as I said, thought-provoking. Read everybody and then make your own mind up. I think that's fair enough. Chris, come back on again real soon and stay in touch with us, and anytime you've got anything to put out there, anything that's vitally important that you've gleaned from your research, do feel free to come back on the programme.
Well, thank you, Richie. It's been a pleasure.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much, Chris. The terrific Christopher Bollyn on the line to us there from his home. I probably shouldn't say, should I? Well, I can say Sweden. Chris is in Sweden.